Larkspur Junction, 1881. A bride's engagement lay dead on the platform before half the town, and a widower's question would change everything. The 2:15 coach had come in off the flats, trailing red dust, and the woman who stepped down last was neat, composed, and utterly alone by the time anyone thought to ask if she needed help. Larkspur Junction was not much of a town by the standards of the cities back east, but it was enough of one for its purposes. A single long street of raw lumber storefronts and a few older brick ones that had survived the last fire. A feed store and a mercantile and a bank with a proper stone face. Church with a spire visible from most anywhere in the valley, and a rail platform that saw perhaps 2 coaches a week, which was more than enough to keep the town current on its own business and everybody else's. It had grown up around cattle money and stayed alive on it, and, like most towns of its kind, it kept a long memory for anything that happened in public, on that platform especially, where half the county's arrivals and departures were witnessed whether the people involved cared to be witnessed or not. Her name was Etta. She carried one bag, a dress that had been carefully pressed before the journey and had not survived it, and a face arranged the way a woman arranges her face when she has decided, somewhere back along the rail line, not to fall apart in front of strangers. She had been the last one off the coach. She would be the last one standing on that platform too, though she did not know it yet. Silas Pruitt was waiting at the far end, a folded paper in one hand, and the look of a man who had rehearsed a speech so many times that the rehearsing itself had made the words worse. He had filed the marriage contract with the agency 10 months back, in a fit of loneliness and bad judgment that had felt, at the time, like the sensible answer to an empty house. He had spent every week since finding new reasons to regret it. He had written no letter to call it off. A letter would have taken more courage than he had, and courage was easier to postpone than to spend. So he had simply let the weeks run on, telling himself there would be time to think of something before the coach ever came, right up until the morning it did. Etta had grown up in a church orphanage 2 counties east, in a long gray building where the girls slept 8 to a room and learned early that wanting things loudly only ever cost you something later. She had stayed on past the age when the other children left, because the matron needed the help and Etta had nowhere in particular to be needed instead. She took in mending from the town nearby, stitched by lamplight after the younger children were down, and set aside every coin that came her way in a tin box under a loose floorboard, though she couldn't have named, if pressed, exactly what she was saving toward. When the agency's solicitation reached the orphanage, a folded notice pinned to the board by the kitchen door, a rancher out west in want of a wife, room and board, and a fair arrangement guaranteed. She had read it twice before she let herself hope. She signed her name in a steady hand. She spent the last of the coins from the tin box on the ticket. For the length of that long train ride west, watching the gray towns give way to open country, and then to nothing at all but grass and sky, it had felt like the beginning of something worth having. She had let herself believe that it would turn out to be her only real mistake in the whole business, and even that one, in the end, would cost her less than it first appeared to. Silas told her, loud enough to carry the length of the platform, that he couldn't go through with it, which was the particular cruelty of it, not the refusal itself, which any honest man might have found his way to in private. By supper, half of Larkspur Junction would know a bride had been left standing there with her belongings at her feet. By morning, the other half would know it too, and know it with embellishments. Etta stood. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her face did what she needed it to do, and nothing more. The same discipline she had built over years of rooms where showing what you felt only gave other people something to use. Silas raised the agency papers once, as if the weight of ink and law might excuse him, though everyone on that platform understood plainly enough that a woman was not a plot of land and could not be claimed by paper alone. He held the papers a moment longer than the gesture required. Then he folded the contract back into his coat and walked off toward the livery without once looking behind him, the way a man walks when he has decided that not looking is the same thing as not having done it. If a story like Etta's is the kind that keeps you company on a long evening, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. It costs little, and it helps keep these stories coming. The platform cleared around her the way a room empties after bad news, everyone finding urgent business elsewhere rather than stand near the wreckage of it. A man who'd come to collect a crate of dry goods suddenly remembered he'd left something at the depot office. A woman waiting on her sister found her sister arriving at that exact moment and hurried her off toward the wagon. Her bag sat at her feet where she'd set it down at last, now that there was no one left to see her do it. The town spread out ahead of her in every direction, a main street of raw lumber and older brick, a church spire past the feed store, hills going pale blue in the distance, and she had no clear notion of what came next, only the old practiced discipline of not letting the not knowing show on her face while she worked out in private. Exactly how little money remained in her purse, and exactly how far it would carry her. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware store with a paper sack of nails and hinges, and stopped on the boardwalk step, the way a person stops when something in front of them doesn't fit the shape of an ordinary afternoon. Wesley Calder was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders from carpentry work, sawdust ground into the cuff of his sleeve from a morning spent framing a neighbor's grain shed, and he carried himself like a man who had been shouldering more than his share for so long that he had stopped noticing the weight of it. He had buried his wife 2 winters back, after a fever that had taken hold in November and never let go, and in the time since he had learned to run a household the way he ran a plane over rough lumber, by force of steady attention. He read the platform in a single glance, the bag, the straight back, the space where a man had clearly just been standing and now was not, the way the whole scene held itself together by will alone. He knew that particular kind of stillness. He had worn it himself, at his own wife's graveside in front of half this same town. And so, without any particular hurry, and without quite deciding to do it until his boots were already moving, he crossed the street. He stopped at the bottom of the platform steps and looked up at her. He did not soften it with sympathy, which she would come to learn was not his way, and which she might well have refused had he tried. "Wesley Calder," he said, "I've got 2 children and a house that wants keeping. I do carpentry 3 days out of the week, so mornings the place would be yours alone." He held her gaze, plain and unhurried, a man laying out the true shape of a thing rather than dressing it up to be taken. It's temporary. Room and board until you've sorted what's next. No obligation past that on either side. She looked at him a moment, taking his measure the way a person takes the measure of a stranger who has just offered her the only door standing open in an unfamiliar town. There was nothing in his face asking her to be grateful. That, more than anything, was what decided her. "Can you cook?" he asked. She met his eyes without flinching. "I can, and I'm not afraid of hard work." She picked up her bag. Then, "Let's go." They walked off the platform together, and behind them the town watched from doorways and boardwalks and filed the whole scene away for later telling, the way small towns do with anything that promises to still be worth talking about come spring. They walked the length of Larkspur Junction's one real street to reach the Calder place, past the mercantile and the church, and a scatter of houses with smoke already rising thin and gray against the cold sky. And Etta was aware, without looking directly at any of it. Wesley did not hurry his pace on her account, nor slow it either. He simply walked as he would have walked any other afternoon, and there was something in that ordinariness that steadied her more than any kindness could have. The Calder place sat at the edge of town, a plain cabin with a horse in the side pen and a porch step that had clearly been meaning to get fixed for some while. The wood gone soft and gray at one corner where the weather had gotten under it. Etta took quiet note of it, the way she took note of most things those first days, quietly and to herself, filing away small facts about a household. She did not yet know if she'd be staying in past the week. Inside, the front room was clean, in the manner of a house kept by a man alone, functional, orderly, nothing soft in it anywhere, the furniture arranged for use rather than for looking at. A workbench ran along the far wall, thick with the good, sharp smell of cedar shavings and linseed oil. The stove did its steady work in the corner, throwing more heat than light. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, and it had the look of something no one in that house had touched in a long while, something everyone there had quietly agreed to leave be. The way a house learns to arrange itself around an absence without ever naming it out loud. Wesley showed her the room off the kitchen was hers, with its own door and its own quiet, and that first night, once the house had gone still around her, Etta sat a long while on the edge of the narrow bed with her one bag still packed at her feet, listening to the unfamiliar settling of an unfamiliar house, a door somewhere, the horse shifting in its pen. The particular way wind found the gaps in board walls it hadn't yet been asked about. She did not unpack that first night. It was not distrust exactly, more a private caution she had carried with her a long time, the habit of a woman who had learned not to plant herself too firmly in ground she might be asked to leave. The children ate at 6, Wesley ate whenever the day let him. Cole came in from the back of the house with the particular timing of a boy who had been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He was 11, already built through the shoulders like his father, with a face that gave nothing away for free and a wariness that sat older on him than his years should have allowed. He had been 8 when his mother died, old enough to remember exactly how the house had sounded before, and he had spent the 2 years since deciding, quietly and without ever saying so, that nothing was going to be allowed to sound that way again. He looked at Etta, the way a person looks at something they've seen a version of before and aren't yet ready to feel differently about. There had been a housekeeper before her, and another before that, neither of whom had lasted the season. Then he looked at his father, said nothing, and went back the way he'd come, which said a good deal on its own. Sadie did not so much enter a room as simply appear in it. She was 7, one ribbon tied properly, and the other hanging loose, too young to hold her brother's careful guard against hoping. She stood near the bedroom doorway with the whole unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. She studied Etta with her entire small face, the frank and total study only a child that age can manage without it being rude. Etta looked back, steady and even, nothing performed for the occasion. Sadie considered this with real seriousness, the way she considered most questions put to her, directly. "A little bit," she admitted. "Come, help me see what's in the larder, then," Etta said, and Sadie came without a moment's hesitation, already reaching up to take her hand as though the matter of trust had been settled somewhere Etta hadn't been present for. Supper that first evening was beans and cornbread and a broth that had no business smelling as good as it did, given what little the larder actually held, a housekeeper's trick of making something out of near nothing, the kind of skill the orphanage had taught her without either of them ever calling it a skill. The smell reached the front room before anyone had sat down to eat it. Wesley came in from the yard, stopped just inside the door, and something crossed his face that he set carefully aside before anyone could read it. It had been a long while since that particular smell had filled that particular room at that particular hour. Cole ate without a word, watching more than eating. Sadie's eyes moved between her bowl and Etta in a steady, watchful rotation, as though she meant to memorize her. Partway through the meal, Sadie set her spoon down and announced that the last woman who'd kept house for them had burned everything she touched, every single time, without fail. Wesley cautioned her, low, with just her name. Sadie looked at Etta instead. She did, though, she insisted, with the flat certainty of a 7-year-old reporting established fact. "Burnt beans are a serious matter," Etta said, eyes on her own plate. Cole's head came up. The corner of his mouth moved once and settled back where it had been, but not quite all the way. He had nothing more to add for the rest of the meal, watching her now with something that had shifted very slightly from wariness toward simple attention, and when supper was finished he stayed at the table longer than he strictly needed to, turning a scrap of kindling over in his hands before finally going off to bed. Wesley noticed all of it without remarking on any of it, which was, Etta was beginning to learn, exactly his way of remarking on things that mattered to him. The next morning, Wesley came off the porch and the loose step held solid under his boot for the first time in longer than he could remember. He stopped, pressed it again with his heel, testing it the way a careful man tests anything he doesn't quite trust yet, and stood there a moment in the cold air, working out how it had come to be fixed and by whose hand, though he already knew. Then he went inside, poured 2 cups of coffee without a word to anyone about it, and left one on the counter near where Etta was working. No one mentioned the step. No one mentioned the coffee either. They drank it together in the early quiet before the children were up, the cold morning settling companionably around the house, and it became, without either of them deciding it should, a small daily habit that neither one mentioned and both came to expect. Cole tested her on the 7th day, the way a boy his age tests any new fact in the household to see whether it holds real weight or only pretends to. He simply did not do the thing she'd asked of him, the wood brought in and stacked by the stove before supper, a task he'd managed without complaint for the housekeepers, before her right up until the moment he decided each of them wasn't staying and settled in at the far end of the yard to see what would happen next. Etta appeared in the doorway of the back room. "Coal, the wood," she said. "No heat in it at all." He looked up. "I was getting to it." "I know. Get to it now, please." He held her gaze a long moment, the way he'd held every housekeeper's gaze at this exact juncture, looking for the give in her that always came sooner or later. He did not find it. He got up and brought the wood in without further argument, stacking it with more care than the task strictly required. She thanked him plainly, and returned to the kitchen, saying nothing further about it, which he seemed, in his own quiet way, to respect more than praise would have earned her. Wesley had heard the whole exchange from his workbench through the thin wall. He set his plane down, sat with the quiet a moment, weighing what he'd just heard, and then picked it back up and went on with his work. The days found their shape after that, the way a household does once the people in it stop testing each other and start simply living alongside one another. Cole began lingering at the table after meals, whittling or reading by the lamp, present in the room in a way he had not been before, close enough to be part of things without ever quite admitting that was what he was doing. Sadie followed Etta from room to room with the devotion of a small, faithful shadow, helping wherever she could reach, carrying spoons 2 at a time, sorting buttons from the sewing basket's lid drawer, announcing the arrival of the mail rider from the front window, and watching close wherever she couldn't reach. Memorizing the whole business of running a house as though it were the most important education a person could receive. Wesley started coming home from his carpentry work at the same hour each evening, no longer letting a job run late into the dark the way he once had, without ever saying out loud why that particular hour mattered to him now. On wash days, Etta hung linens on the line strung between the porch post and the pine at the yard's edge, and Sadie handed her the pins 1 at a time from a little tin cup, narrating the whole operation to an audience of none. On market days, the 2 of them walked into town together for flour and coffee and thread, and Sadie held tight to 2 fingers of Etta's hand the entire way there and back, chattering about whatever crossed her mind, while Cole trailed a careful distance behind. Late that same month, a neighboring family lost the roof off their barn to a windstorm that tore through the valley overnight, and half the township turned out the following Saturday to raise a new one before the weather worsened further. Wesley worked the frame from sunup, his carpentry skill plainly the reason 3 different men sought his opinion before touching a joint, and Etta found herself, without quite meaning to volunteer for it, at the long trestle table set up in the yard, ladling out stew alongside women who had known each other's families for 2 generations and had not, until that morning, known what to make of her. It was Sadie running underfoot with the other children and calling out for her mama to come see the new kittens in the loft, who did more to settle the matter than anything Etta might have said for herself. By the time the last rafter went up and the sun had dropped behind the western ridge, 3 different women wanted her molasses recipe, and one, carefully, and without any of Prudence Hale's rehearsed concern in it, wanted to know how she and Wesley had come to find each other, a question Etta met plainly and without embarrassment over that long autumn to meet most things. One evening, Etta read to Sadie from the storybook on the shelf, doing all the voices without a trace of embarrassment, giving the wolf a low growl and the fox a sly little lilt that made Sadie laugh outright. Sadie leaned into her side with the complete trust of a child who has made up her mind and sees no reason to revisit the question. Cole sat at the far end of the room with something small in his hands, a piece of wood he was slowly working into the rough shape of a horse. He did not look up. He did not leave either, and by the second verse his knife had gone still in his hands, the carving forgotten, listening. A hard frost came through in the second week of that month and froze the water barrels solid, and Wesley spent a whole Saturday morning splitting extra wood against the cold that everyone in the county could feel coming. Etta made a soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, and sent Sadie out with a bowl of it for her father, before he'd even finished the woodpile, and Wesley stood in the yard eating it straight from the bowl in the cold air, watching his own breath fog above the steam. That the house had started running differently than it had in longer than he wanted to count. By the time the frost had settled into the mornings for good and stayed there, Sadie had stopped trailing Etta like a guest in the house, and started trailing her like a child who was already home, and Cole had stopped watching Etta like a threat to be outlasted, like something he was afraid to want too openly, in case wanting it turned out to be a mistake. It was a gray, unremarkable morning when it happened, the kind of morning nobody would have marked as different from any other right up until it was. Sadie was crossing the kitchen in her stocking feet, still warm from sleep and lost in some private errand of her own, when she caught her toe on the threshold and went down hard onto both palms. The sound she made was the startled kind, the kind that comes before a child has decided whether the moment calls for tears. She decided that it did. Etta was down on the floor with her before the crying had properly started, taking both small hands in her own, turning the palms to the light, holding them warm and steady. And Sadie, without meaning to say anything at all, without any decision behind it whatsoever, said the word that was simply, plainly true. Mama, it went into that cabin and did not leave it. Etta's hands stayed exactly where they were. One breath, no more. Then she gathered the girl in and held her until the crying ran itself all the way out, calm and certain, giving no outward sign of what that one small word had just done to the room around her, though something in her chest had gone tight and full all at once, in a way she would not have had words for even if anyone had asked her to try. Wesley was standing in the bedroom doorway. He had heard it plainly, every syllable of it carrying clean down the short hallway. He stood with one hand braced on the frame, looking down the hallway without moving, something working through him that he kept his eyes carefully turned away from. The way a man looks away from a fire he isn't ready to feel the full heat of yet. Some things change the moment you look at them straight on, and he was not, that particular morning, prepared to look at this one straight on. At the table, Cole had gone still, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth and forgotten there. He was 11 years old, and he knew exactly what he'd just heard and exactly what it meant, and something in his face that had been shut tight for 2 long years began, slowly, and without any fuss about it, to work its way toward open. Wesley went back into his room and sat on the edge of the bed with one hand flat against his knee, and stayed there a while as the quiet morning moved on around the house without him, giving himself the space, in private, to feel the thing he wasn't yet ready to say aloud to anyone. Prudence Hale came to stand beside Etta at the general store counter on a Friday afternoon, wearing the warm, rehearsed manner of a woman delivering concern she had practiced at home in front of a mirror, the kind of concern that always seemed to arrive dressed as kindness and priced considerably higher. She spoke of appearances, of what people were beginning to say around town, of the shape a situation naturally takes when it's left unattended too long without the proper paperwork behind it, and of the confusion children pick up when they're given the wrong idea of what an arrangement actually is. She chose her words the way a person chooses tools for the particular job she means them to do, laying each one down with care. She left without buying a single thing, which struck Etta, in its own way, as the most honest part of the whole conversation. Etta set her coins on the counter, one at a time, and walked home along the same street she'd been walked down that first afternoon, past the same church spire and the same feed store, and felt the same watchful curtains, though she did not turn her head to confirm it. She was 24 years old, and she had been measured by women with prepared voices, in enough rooms over enough years to have built a durable patience for it. the patience of a woman who understands that another person's estimation of her worth is not, in fact, the truth of the matter. Only a story that person needed to tell about her for reasons of their own. She stood at the kitchen window afterward with her hands on the sill and looked out at the yard, the line of pines beyond it and the flat, cold sky, longer than she strictly needed to, letting the old familiar sting of it move through her and out again the way she had learned over years of practice. Then she went and started supper anyway, because supper still needed starting, regardless of what Prudence Hale thought she knew. That evening, Wesley stood at the stove while she finished the dishes, and without looking up from the fire, he asked, "You all right?" It was not a question he'd asked her before, not directly, and something in the plainness of it told her he already half knew the answer and was only confirming it out of respect for the asking. She kept her hands in the basin and thought about it honestly before answering, the way she thought about most things he put to her. "I am," she found saying it that it was mostly true. He nodded once toward the flames and let it be. No further questions, no attempt to fix what didn't need fixing. Only the fact of having asked laid quietly down between them like another small daily habit neither one would name. She went back to the dishes and the room held its quiet comfortably around the both of them, the stove ticking as it cooled, the children's voices carrying faint and easy from the other room. If you've made it this far into Etta's story, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name, you'll never miss the next one. 6 weeks after that, Frank Doyle had no intention whatsoever of causing trouble. He was at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, talking the way men talk at the tail end of a long day, easy, unhurried, no weight behind it, the kind of talk that passes between neighbors without either one meaning much by it. He said the Calder place looked different lately. Smoke at the right hours of the morning, where before it had come late or not at all. The children seemed steadier than they had any right to be considering. That woman from the platform, the one Silas had left standing there in front of half the town, something about her had settled that whole household, and settled it quicker than anyone had expected. The kids had taken to her like Frank hadn't seen in a long while, the older boy coming around to her, careful as he was about coming around to anybody. The little one had started calling her mama outright, plain as you please, in front of God and the whole street. Frank reached for his glass, not noticing that Silas Pruitt had gone still at the far end of the bar, his own glass forgotten in front of him. In the weeks between the platform and the saloon, Silas had crossed paths with the Calder household exactly twice, and both times had gone worse for him than the last. The first was at the feed store, where he'd nearly collided with Cole coming out the door with a sack of grain balanced on one shoulder, and the boy had simply looked at him, no anger in it, nothing so satisfying as anger, only a flat, appraising look that made Silas feel smaller than any shouting match could have, before walking on without a word. The second was at a distance, from the boardwalk outside the saloon on an ordinary Sunday, watching the Calder wagon roll past on its way to church, Sadie's small voice carrying clear across the street asking her papa something that made Wesley laugh outright. Unguarded sound Silas did not remember ever hearing from the man in all the years they'd lived in the same small town. He had gone inside and ordered a whiskey he did not particularly want, and sat with it a long while turning the agency papers over in his coat pocket without taking them out, telling himself the arrangement was still on paper. Silas had spent the week since the platform in a kind of low, persistent regret that he had not expected and did not much care for, the sort that follows a man around at odd hours and will not be talked out of itself no matter how many times he tells himself he'd done the sensible thing. He had the agency papers in his coat pocket still, where they'd sat for weeks like a stone he hadn't found the will to set down, and he had watched, from a careful distance, as the town's opinion of the whole business turned steadily away from him and toward her, until it seemed like the only two people left in Larkspur Junction who still thought of it as unfinished were himself and, perhaps, no one else at all. Now, hearing Frank talk so easily of a warm house and a woman the children called Mama, a picture began forming behind his eyes uninvited. Warm light in the windows, children settled and steady, smoke at the right hour. Out of a woman he had walked away from on a public platform without so much as a backward glance. Pride was a strange, stubborn thing, and his had sat wrong ever since that afternoon, looking for some way to set itself right again that had nothing to do with actually being sorry. "Where does Calder live?" he asked. No one in particular, and the men nearest him went quiet enough that Frank, too late, understood exactly what he'd just set in motion. It was a Thursday morning, cold and clear, the kind of sharp, bright morning that makes a town's one main street look almost handsome when Wesley and Etta came out of the post office together. He'd gone in to collect a timber notice. She'd walked along because the children were at school, and the morning simply ran that way between them. Now an errand shared without either one having to ask the other to come. Silas stepped into the middle of the street with the agency papers held up in one hand, his voice pitched to carry the whole block, the way a man's voice carries when he has decided badly. That being loud is the same thing as being right. The fare was paid, he said, the contract signed. An obligation doesn't dissolve just because a woman's found somewhere more comfortable to be. He held the papers aloft like a deed, though every soul on that street understood full well what they actually were, and were not, and had understood it back on the platform 10 months before, too. Then he used the word his, and the whole street heard exactly where it landed, the word sitting ugly and wrong in the cold morning air. Everything slowed. A woman near the dry goods stopped mid-stride, a basket forgotten on her arm. Two men outside the feed store turned to watch, their own business set aside. The cold morning air seemed to hold the whole scene in place, waiting to see which way it would break. Etta stood beside Wesley. She did not step back. She did not look at Silas at all. She held herself the way she had held herself on that platform months before, still straight, unfinished business, except that this time there was someone standing beside her, and the whole street could plainly see that he had not moved an inch, not so much as a shift of weight, since the moment Silas opened his mouth. Wesley looked at the papers. He looked at Silas, at the particular kind of man who mistakes volume for a claim on something. Then he turned to Etta, and his voice, when it came, was low and even, meant for her alone, though the whole street could hear it anyway. "Stay here," he said, not a command. The way a man speaks to someone, he intends to come straight back to, and means it. He walked to the bank, 6 minutes inside, by the clock over the barbershop door that half the street found themselves watching without quite meaning to. He came back out with money he'd kept hidden beneath the floorboards for 3 years, every dollar he'd been quietly setting aside toward buying back into a proper cattle spread of his own. The slow, patient labor of a man rebuilding from bare ground up after a fever took everything else from him one November. He crossed the street, pressed the money into Silas's hand and held it there until Silas's fingers closed around it whether he liked it or not, closed around 3 years of another man's careful, patient saving. That settles the fare, the fee, and every excuse you rode in here with. Flat and final, no heat in it, only certainty. It doesn't buy her, it frees her from you. Now go." Silas looked down at the money in his fist, its weight suddenly much heavier than the paper he'd carried in 10 months' worth of pockets. He looked around at the street, looking back at him, at faces he'd known his whole life, wearing expressions he did not much care to read. He looked once, briefly, at Etta, and whatever he found written on her face was plainly not what he had ridden into town expecting to find. No fear in it, no plea, nothing at all that needed him. Then he turned, mounted his horse, without another word to anyone, and rode out past the church spire and the feed store and the edge of town, and the cold morning closed quietly behind him like a door being set gently back on its hinge. The street held its breath a moment longer, then let it go all at once, the ordinary noise of a town returning by degrees. Wesley turned, not to the crowd, not to accept whatever was owed him for what he'd just done. She was already looking at him. Her hands hung at her sides. The exhaustion she had carried since that first afternoon on the platform, the low hum of it she had carried so long she'd nearly stopped noticing it herself, was gone from her eyes, and something steadier had taken its place, the look of a woman standing at last on ground that holds. He stood in front of her. The wind came down off the hills, between them clean and cold. He had crossed that street before he had properly decided to. He had left a cup of coffee on a counter every morning since, and made nothing of it. He had just handed 3 years of hard-kept savings to another man, without a second's hesitation, without a flicker of regret crossing his face, because standing by while she was claimed like property in the middle of a public street was simply not a thing he was able to do, whatever it cost him. He was not a man given to dressing things up finer than they were, and he did not intend to start now, in front of half the town, with the wind cutting between them. "If that's what you want," she answered, quiet, testing the shape of it, "it's what I want, plain, no hesitation in it at all." She looked at this man, at the whole steady, unhurried, uncomplicated fact of him, and took for herself the full measure of time that choosing required, and nobody on that cold street hurried her through it. Not Wesley, not the watching town, not the 10 months of hard history that had led her by such a strange road. "Yes," she said quietly, and completely with nothing held back. "That's what I want." He let out a long, slow breath, one she felt more than heard, and his hand found hers and closed around it, work-roughened and warm. Around them, the town came back to itself, boots on the boardwalk, a door somewhere opening and falling shut, the wind steady and clean off the hills, the pale winter sky going on overhead as if nothing at all had happened, though everyone on that street knew otherwise and would be telling it, in one form or another. The cattle spread would have to wait a while longer, the 3 years of savings gone to buy something no deed would ever properly record. For the first time in years, waiting didn't feel to Wesley like losing anything at all. They were married the following month, a small gathering at the church with the Junction's reverend presiding, the pews perhaps 2/3 full, which for a town that size counted as a considerable turnout. Sadie wore a new ribbon for the occasion, both of them tied properly this time, and clutched a fistful of dried wildflowers someone had found for her at that time of year. Cole stood at his father's shoulder in a collar that plainly itched him, shifting his weight twice during the vows. But his face, for once, held nothing back at all. No wariness left in it, no waiting for the next loss to arrive, only a boy watching something good happen to people he had decided, sometime that autumn without ever announcing it, he loved. Frank Doyle came and stood near the back, forever pleased with himself for having predicted out loud in the saloon of all places exactly the ending everyone else could already see coming, though nobody troubled to point out how near a different kind of trouble that same loose talk had come to starting. Prudence Hale attended as well, in her good hat, and confided to a neighbor on the way out that she had always thought the two of them well suited, which nobody troubled to correct either, since by then it had become simply true whatever anyone had once said about it at a store counter on a Friday afternoon. Cole was at the table that evening with a short length of wood and his father's smallest plane, working the edge down by feel, the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth, the little wooden horse from weeks before finally nearing its finished shape. Sadie was on the floor with her rag doll, deep in some matter of considerable 7-year-old importance that plainly did not require adult involvement, the doll now wearing a scrap of ribbon that matched her own. From the stove came the smell of something with molasses in it, a new recipe Etta was still working out, adjusting as she went, the kind of smell that gets into the walls of a kitchen and stays there for years afterward, long past the point. The door opened, cold air, and then Wesley's boots on the step, the sound of a man who knows that being expected home is no longer something he takes for granted, and who has stopped these days taking much of anything for granted at all. Sadie raised the rag doll briefly in his direction by way of greeting, and went straight back to her business. Cole glanced up at his father in the doorway, then looked back down at the plane and kept working, though the look he'd given carried something in it that hadn't been there back at the beginning of things. An ease, a settledness, the look of a boy who has finally stopped waiting for the next loss to arrive. Wesley hung his coat, crossed to the stove, and stood beside Etta, looking at what simmered there. She moved the spoon toward him without a word. He tasted it, considered it quietly, unhurried, and looked at her. She took the spoon back before he could say a thing. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth moved, just once, the closest thing to a laugh he generally allowed himself, in front of the stove, and he went to hang his coat properly, and left her to the rest of it. On the shelf above the window, the small sewing basket sat where it had always sat. No longer an object, the household quietly avoided, but simply a part of the room again. The late afternoon light, finding the wooden lid and resting there. Etta had taken it down once, early on, turned it over in her hands, and set it back exactly where she'd found it, understanding, without being told, that some things are honored by being left alone. Outside wind moved through the pines at the edge of the property. The horse shifted in its pen. Somewhere past the tree line, a bird called once, long and unhurried, and then the yard settled back into its evening quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer needed anyone to fill it. The cabin held its warmth. It was not waiting for anyone anymore. Spring came slow to the valley that year, the way it always did, frost giving up its hold on the mornings one reluctant day at a time. And by the time the first green showed along the fence line, the household had settled into a rhythm nobody remarked on anymore because it no longer felt like something that needed remarking on. Cole had grown another inch and outgrown his good collar entirely. Sadie had lost a front tooth and took to showing the gap to anyone who'd look at it. Wesley had gone back to setting a little money aside again, slower this time, in no particular hurry toward the cattle spread he'd once meant to buy back into, because waiting, these days, cost him nothing at all. And Etta, who had arrived in that valley with a single bag and a face arranged not to fall apart in front of strangers, had stopped needing to arrange her face for anyone in that house. Not once, not ever, which was its own kind of ordinary miracle that nobody in Larkspur Junction thought to call a miracle. Because, from where the town stood, it simply looked like a family, same as any other, going on about its business under a wide western sky. And that was the story of Etta, a woman who arrived in Larkspur Junction with nothing in the world but a bag and a straight spine, and left it, in time, with everything that actually matters. A husband who had crossed a street for her before he'd decided to. A boy who'd learned to trust a face slowly and completely after 2 hard years of not trusting anyone at all, and a little girl for whom the word mama had never once needed explaining, only saying on an ordinary gray morning when it turned out to already be true. Before we close out tonight, if a story like this one is worth an evening of your time, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It's a small thing that means a great deal to a small channel, and it's how you'll walk with us into the next one. If Etta and Wesley's story found something in you tonight, tell us in the comments. We read every one of them, and we'd love to know which part stayed with you longest. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and we'll see you in the next story.